Well, greetings. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Elliott West. I am Professor Emeritus at the University of Arkansas, and I'm here to give a presentation on the book that I recently published, Continental Reckoning, the American West in the Age of Expansion. I'm here at the invitation of the National Archives. I want to thank them certainly for that invitation, for the opportunity to do this program. I want to thank them also for the incomparable work that they do in opening up the research of the American past to historians and to lay folks. It's something that historians rely on absolutely. Certainly, it's an institution that I've used many times over the years. My dissertation was based in part on the National Archives, and I used it certainly in the preparation of this book. So thank you to the National Archives. Thank you again, all of you, for tuning in. The book, as I said, is Continental Reckoning. It is a, oops, I can't seem to get the slide to advance here. There we go. It was published in February by the University of Nebraska Press. It's a book I've worked on for well more than 20 years. Let me talk a little bit about what the book is about and why I think it's worth people paying attention to it. The story is certainly critically important to understanding the course of certainly recent American history. Begin with I think an often overlooked or underappreciated fact: the Age of Expansion. By that I mean a period that began in the 1840s in this country. In only 3 years, 1845 to 1848. The United States expanded by roughly 1.2 million acres. That's about 1.2 million square miles. That's roughly 3/4 billion acres. It began in 1845 with the annexation of Texas down there at the bottom of the map. The next year, 1846, the United States, in a treaty with Great Britain, acquired the Pacific Northwest, the so-called Oregon country. That same year, 1846, we went to war with our neighbor to the south, Mexico. A war that lasted about 2 years. 1848, it ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which we gained what's called the Mexican Cession, basically the American Southwest, California and the American Southwest. 3 years, like a little bit less than 3 years, about 28 months and 19 days, as it turned out, in which we acquired an enormous amount of territory. To get an idea of how much land we're talking about, try to imagine the United States expanding over the next 3 years by that same amount of territory, expanding now to the south, not to the west, to the south. What would the United States look like if we were to expand that much, add that much territory to the nation during that period of time? Well, the United States would stretch southward. We would acquire all of Mexico, all of Central America, and about 1/2 of the country of Colombia. Or if you want to think a little more globally here, try to imagine that between today, May 9th, 2023, and September the 24th, 2025, the United States would add to its territory land roughly equal, a little bit less than that of modern India. I think it's fair to say we can all agree that things would happen following that. Try to begin to get your mind around the kind of implications of what it meant to add that much territory, the challenges that would present, the opportunities that would present. It was a huge turning point, a huge pivot in the American story. And what was this country? It wasn't one thing. This country that we acquired. It was divided among scores of different centers of power. Dozens of different cultures, mostly Native American cultures, many different peoples, an enormously diverse geography. And all of that somehow had to be brought under the control of the United States. Now, that's in 1848. Fast forward about 30 years, let's say around 1880. What did this country look like at that point? Look like that. In roughly 30 years, that's well less than half of a normal lifetime. In 30 years, this country was organized politically. It was bound into the nation by technologies of transportation and communication. It was developed economically. It was virtually transformed environmentally, physically. 30 years. It happened so fast. By 1880, there is now what we now would call the American West. So that's one thing that I'm doing in this book. I'm trying to tell the story of this extraordinary episode, beginning with the expansion of the 1840s, taking the story up to about 1880. What we can really say is sort of the birth of this modern American region. It is somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the contiguous 48 states. An amazing story, really, incredibly diverse story, diverse. It has so many chapters to it. So that's one thing. But the book is really about two things. As I began to develop and research and to write this story, I became increasingly convinced that there were really two stories here. One was the birth of the West. The other was the absolutely critical role that this new part of America, the American West, played in one of the great transformations of American history. During these same years, roughly the second half of the 19th century, that the fundamental trajectory of the United States shifts onto a new course. It shifts. This story, this narrative, the American narrative, shifts onto a new course that carries us into what we would come to know in the 20th and the 21st centuries as modern America. What we see during these years is not just the emergence of the West, not just the birth of the West, we also see the emergence and the birth of modern America, modern America. And what I'm arguing in this book is that these two developments are absolutely intertwined. They're like historical twins. And like human twins, in many ways, you really can't understand one without the other. These two stories are bound up together. And I think we don't appreciate that enough. We don't appreciate enough the way in which the American West played, the emergence of the American West played in the creation of this nation that we know as modern, the modern American state. It's quite a transformation, and it's critically important to understanding who we are today. So what I'd like to do today is to concentrate on that second story, the relationship between the emergence of the West and the emergence of modern America. Concentrate on that second story and to illustrate that by three examples of these connections between these two developments, connections between the birth of the West and the birth of modern America. One way to get at that is to play kind of a mind game. Ask yourself, when you talk about modern America, what do you mean? What are we looking at? You might try to make a list of those traits, those things that that identify modern America as different from the America that came before. Ask yourself, what is it about the United States in the 20th century, in the 21st century, that is fundamentally different from the United States in, let's say, 1850, 1840, 1830? What is it? What is it that makes modern America modern? What is it? Make a list. Now, ask yourself, looking at that list, looking at those traits, those distinctive traits of modern America, are there any ways we can connect them to this emergence of the West, to the birth of the West? Are there any ways that we can suggest how the emergence of the birth of the West then played roles in the transformation and these distinctive traits that came about by the turn of the century, by the opening of the 20th century? I think there were. I became convinced that there were many examples of this. What I'd like to do today is to look at three of them, three cases in which we can look at these distinctive traits of modern America and relate them to the events of the consolidation of the West, its integration into the nation, its integration into this larger world. Look at a few of those. What is it? What is it that distinguishes modern America? Well, for one thing, I think it's irrefutable. I think it's something we can certainly all agree upon that modern America, the modern United States, today is the great global economic superpower. We're all aware, of course, that in some ways we're being challenged by others, China in particular. But put this in perspective. Uh, the gross domestic product of the United States today, about $20 trillion annually, um, is 1.5 times greater than that of China. It is several times greater than those following China, of the United Kingdom, of Germany, of Japan. It's really just no question. We are the 800-pound gorilla, economically speaking, of the global economy, not just of the world today. We are the greatest economic power in the history of humanity. How did that happen? And how might the American West have played a role in that after its acquisition in the 1840s and over the next 30, 40, 50 years? Let's begin by what I call in the book the great coincidence. The great coincidence. The last of those three steps of expansion, the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended that war, that treaty was signed by this man on the left, Nicholas Trist, on February the 2nd, 1848, in this suburb of Mexico City. That's February 2nd. January 24th, 1848, in Northern California, along the American River, this other man on the left, James Marshall, looked down. He was helping. He was a New Jersey carpenter who had come out during the gold rush, and came out to California to work on John Sutter's estate. And he was helping to build a mill. And he looked down into the American River, and he saw this little fleck, glittering fleck. He reached down, picked it up. It was gold. A little fleck of gold that was worth about $half at that time. That set loose what was far and away up until that time the greatest gold rush in human history. It's difficult to overestimate the amount of gold, the impact of this gold rush on the American economy during the next several years. So again, think of this now. January 24th, Marshall finds that first speck of gold. February the 2nd, 9 days later, that's about 200 hours. Within about 200 hours, the United States acquires California, and California begins to be revealed as arguably the richest place on planet Earth. That's what I call the great coincidence, and its impact was enormous. As I said, this gold rush was by magnitudes greater than anything that had happened before. More gold was mined in the banner year of 1852 in California than had been mined across the world during the entire 18th century. More gold was mined in California and in Australia, a rush that came soon after that, during the first 7 or 8 years after Marshall's discovery, that had been mined across the entire world from 1492, from the Columbian landfall, until 1848. So much gold was being produced in California that when the San Francisco Mint was founded, and they began to process this gold into gold bricks, they discovered that so much gold was being processed that they couldn't handle it all. The furnaces couldn't handle it all, and gold dust was being blown out of the smokestacks of the mill. They had to go around into neighborhood buildings and neighboring buildings and sort of sweep up the gold dust, these gilded rooftops of these buildings. A lot of gold. And this was followed over the next several years by other rushes, gold and then silver rushes. The first this great silver rush at the Comstock Lode in 1858. This map here shows these gold and silver stripes across the American West. So, in other words, exactly coincident with the acquisition of the far West, the West begins to churn out enormous amounts of wealth. And this is precisely at the time when the United States was retooling into this modern economy, an economy that is industrial, an economy that is much more urban. This is in other words, the West began to provide the raw wealth, the funds necessary for this great retooling of the American economy. So, did the American economy begin to transform during these years into the one that we would know in the next century, that we know today as this economic superpower? Yes, it did. How was it financed? It was financed in part by this extraordinary outpouring of wealth that immediately began to be revealed, began to be discovered in this new part of the nation. And that turned out to be just the start of it. Besides gold and silver, which are the certain most important what are called precious metals in the world, the most valuable at the time, the most valuable non-precious metal was copper. Copper that was necessary for the wiring of this electrification of this new economy. Copper is absolutely essential for the building of factories. Copper absolutely essential for the creation of this new communications network of the telegraph. Well, turns out that the American West was also at the time the richest area on Earth for the production of copper. Places like Montana, Butte, Montana, places like Arizona, elsewhere. This map shows you copper deposits today, but you can see these go back to the far west there, the southwest, and the northern plains. The United States was the leading producer by 1880. The United States was far and away the leading producer of copper across the world at the very time that copper was absolutely essential for this economic industrial transformation of the economy. Now, this transformation was one from the age of wood, the earlier economy, to the age of iron and steel. But you got to remember that wood was still very, very important in this. Wood necessary for constructing railroads. Wood necessary for the construction of the great, most productive mines in the West. Enormous amounts of wood were needed. The whole forest was stripped in the West to provide the wood necessary for these changes. And as it turned out, the American West was, to say the least, a place where you could find a lot of wood. Those rich forests of the Northwest, the great redwood forests of the Northwest, these huge old growth forests of the Pacific West. We need wood. Well, we got it, and we got it from this new land that we had acquired. So it's almost as if, as we began this great transformation, which would carry us into this role of economic superpower, if we needed something, all we needed to do was sort of look around the West. There it was. The West provided the raw wealth, the raw wealth in gold and silver, the other kinds of subsidiary necessities for this, like copper, wood, and it would go on and on. Take this into the future. Think of what we would need in the 20th century: petroleum, for this new economy based on the internal combustion engine. Uranium for nuclear power. Look around, we need something, we look to the West, and there it is. The West then was this great storehouse, this treasure house of resources necessary for this critical transformation. And it shows up in places that you might not otherwise expect. All of us are familiar with the appalling slaughter of the American bison in the 19th century, the near extinction of this one of the most prolific life forms on the North American continent. Within 10 years, the surviving population of bison, which is probably around 12 to 15 million in 1870, was reduced to barely 1,000. It's a famous story. It's a story that we shake our heads and cluck our tongues about. But we need to ask ourselves, how did that happen? Why did that happen? Why? Suddenly, this was in the year 1872, as it turned out. Why did, right at that moment, suddenly there was this massive destruction of bison on the plains? Well, it's a story basically of supply and demand. there was suddenly, around 1872, suddenly a voracious demand for bison hides. Why? Well, there was a global shortage of leather. Leather that had been supplied up to that point, um, partly by the United States, mostly by the nation of Argentina. But that supply of cattle in Argentina providing that leather was running dry. Why did they need so much? It wasn't for what we normally think of, belts and boots and so forth. It was rather for factories. Factories. The factories that were appearing in the United States, the factories appearing in Western Europe, needed enormous amounts of leather for belts, like on this photograph, for the gaskets in these things. This was part of the raw stuff that factories, that nations needed for their industrialization. We don't normally think of that, but that was a huge demand. And it was discovered in 1871, 72. It was discovered that, in fact, well, they were running out of cattle, but bison hides could be processed into perfectly usable industrial leather. Suddenly, at that point, there was this almost this extraordinary demand for those animals that were grazing out there on the Great Plains. And just as suddenly, they began to be absolutely devastated. Slaughter of the bison had this, as you can see in this slide, a kind of itself a kind of industrial look. In a way, this was sort of industry on the Great Plains, shipped out by these new systems of transportation, like that of the railroad. So, why did the bison almost disappear over 10 years? Thank God they didn't. They made a comeback. But why they did? Well, what killed them? Well, the factories did. In a way, we can say that the factories ate the bison. Once again, the American West was providing this fundamental resource that was necessary for this transformation of the American economy. And you see this happening all over. Agriculture, farming, like in the California Central Valley, is essentially an industrial enterprise. So the American West is in many ways leading the way toward this economic transformation by its own efforts, applying industrial technologies to agriculture, the massive production of grain coming out of the Central Valley. It was sent not just to the east in the United States, but it was sent over the Pacific Rim, China. It was sent more than 17,000 nautical miles to England. California Central Valley was the primary foreign source of wheat, of grain in England. And people in Liverpool sat down to dinner and had bread. Quite often, the bread we were eating came from California, being produced in California by these new industrial techniques. And this was spread to the Great Plains. They're what are called bonanza farms. This is the illustration of the cover of the book. These essentially industrial techniques applied to the growing of crops. So the West itself is in many ways leading the way in this industrialization, this transformation into a modern industrial power. So the first point I would make is if we can agree that the United States is an economic superpower, and if we can then look to the West to help us understand how that came about, I think we can see some obvious connections here, both in the resources necessary and examples of this economic transformation. A second way in which we can see the West as a force in the modernization of America. Another thing I think we can agree on is that the United States today is, I think, again, without question, the leading scientific force in the world. Different ways we can measure this. I would for example, I would ask the question, okay, over the past several years, past 10 years, looking at the Nobel Prizes in the sciences, how many have been given to, how many Nobel laureates are there in the United States? And how does that compare with other nations? If you do that, what you will see is that the number of Nobel laureates in the United States in these scientific areas is greater than the next 6 nations on that list. So we are once again, Caltech or Bell Labs or MIT or whatever, we are the superpower in scientific research. How did that happen? It's not something we would normally associate with the American West. We think of sort of lonesome cowboys and, and sourdoughs and miners along creeks in California. But one of the things that surprised me when I got into research is is how the West during these years was arguably the most fertile and active scientific laboratory on Earth in field after field after field after field. Geology, and archaeology, and anthropology, and epidemiology, and oceanography. Take an ology and look to the west, and you will see, you're likely to see extraordinary work being done out west in this research and taking that is contributing to this period, which was, I think, again, without question, one of the most active and progressive periods in the advance of scientific thought in modern history. And again, we can use many examples to illustrate this, but let me focus on one. This was one of the arguably might be called one of the prince of sciences during these years, and that is the field of paleontology. It is the investigation of ancient life through the search for fossils and the attempt to make some sense out of that fossil records. The American West was, without doubt, the most active laboratory in paleontology during these years. And so I'll try to explain it in a moment. There was a reason for this. Why paleontology was such an active field. Why there was such attention given to this field. But the first point to make is the extraordinary effort that was made out west and the extraordinary contributions of the West in this area. Two men in particular are associated with this more than any others. Well, these two fellows, O.C. Marsh and Edward Cope, they were both Easterners. Marsh was a professor of paleontology at Yale University. Edward Cope was a native Pennsylvanian, the son of a very wealthy Pennsylvania family. He was an independent researcher. But together, Marsh and Cope were the key figures in this remarkable effort during this time. They were also bitter rivals. They, quite frankly, loathed each other, and they were engaged in what some authors have called the Bone Wars. This bitter competition to come up with the most finds between them and to make the greatest splash. This was incidentally sort of front page news. This was a huge story at the time. There's a great popular interest in the competition and the rivalry between these two guys. Michael Crichton, the popular novelist, has even written a novel based on this rivalry. But what struck me, which was interesting to me, was that this work in the West in paleontology was conducted not just by these superstars. I'll talk more about them in just a moment. But also by ordinary Westerners, people on the ground itself. Here's one example. Bill Reed, William H. Bill Reed. Bill Reed, as you can see here from the slide, was a meat hunter for the Union Pacific Railroad. He was hired to provide meat, meals for the people building for the railroad and for those working the railroad afterwards, hunting bison, hunting elk, hunting deer to provide them. But Reed was also one of many examples out there who became sort of amateur bone hunters, amateur paleontologists. Pardon me. He was self-taught, read up on it himself, so he was able to identify these finds that he would make. And he and another fellow meat hunter, came across one in particular that caught his interest. He contacted O.C. Marsh told him about it, asked to be paid for it, and he was. Marsh took him up on it, and Marsh ended up hiring him as his primary sort of field man working out there. Reed was responsible for discovering one of the great fossil beds in the West, the Como fossil beds in Wyoming. And Reed was the man who discovered and helped excavate and put together this very famous example. This is the Diplodocus carnegii, which was in today in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Some of you might have seen it. So Bill Reed, the meat hunter, who went on to become a sheep rancher later, was an example, one example of one of these sort of ordinary guys out there who was caught up in this fever, caught up in this passion of searching through the chalk beds of the American Great Plains to find to unveil unveil these great mysteries of the past. Another, Charles Sternberg. Sternberg was a teenager back east when he came out to Kansas to join his brother. His brother was a surgeon, a doctor at Fort Harker, Kansas. His brother also had a ranch outside of Fort Harker. Here's Harker. This is a desolate western post, and he asked Charles to come out to help him with the ranch. And as Charles was doing that, he became fascinated by the discovery, first of all, of fossils of ancient plant life, the area of what's called paleobotany. And he eventually collected what became one of the great gatherings of paleobotany. It's today in the Museum of Natural History back east in Washington. And then he went on Sternberg went on to a long career in paleontology, in the search for the bones of ancient life. It was Sternberg, for example, and you can go to museums across the Western world and find the results of Sternberg's work. This is in the London Museum of Natural History. This is a Triceratops discovered by Sternberg. So what we see then out west is this remarkable series of discoveries, hundreds of new species, including dozens and dozens of dinosaurs, were discovered through the work of people like Marsh and Koch, and people like Reed and Sternberg and others out there. It was a remarkable effort. Why was there such attention to paleontology? Why was this behind really this passion bone hunting during these years? Well, I think you can guess. It was tied up directly with what was certainly the most volatile, most hotly contested question of the day. And that revolved around, of course, the work of the ideas and theories of Charles Darwin, of evolution through natural selection, which had implications not just for American science, but of course for the very understanding of who humans are, of our deep past, moral, theological meanings, in addition to scientific meanings. Well, it was that really drove, I think, more than anything else, the search for ancient life through its fossil remains. Geology, depended upon the Earth being incomparably older than what people had believed before. Certainly older than the standard sort of theological estimates of the age of the Earth. The Earth must have been, Darwin was saying, it had to have been millions and millions of years old, not thousands of years old, for this evolution to provide the time for this evolution to take place. So the geologists were establishing the antiquity of the Earth. The geologists were showing, in fact, the Earth is old enough to give room, to give the time for Darwin's ideas to develop. It was the paleontologist who would get down to basics and to try to pursue the questions of just how this worked, how natural selection worked. Probably the most important work was done by Marsh himself, of the great pair, Marsh and Koch. It was Marsh who came up with the discoveries that went the farthest toward confirming Darwin's ideas. Here he is Center top, of course, these are all Yale grad students, by the way. Marsh would go out with these teams of graduate students out to the West every year, almost every year, in search of the fossil remains to try to piece this together. Working also with those locals out there like Reed and Sternberg. Well, it was Marsh who came up with what were, I think, the two most important discoveries that confirmed Darwin's ideas of evolution through natural selection. The first one had to do with a sequencing of evolutionary change. Darwin argued that if you take any living species today, you would see that it was the product of step by step by step by step by step backward through gradual changes over time, sort of links in an evolutionary chain that carried us into an animal, any kind of a species that we see today, human beings included. Well, his critics said that's interesting, but prove it. Do you have any fossil examples of that? Darwin didn't, but Marsh came up with one. Marsh provided this first evolutionary chain through the collection of bones of the American horse, Equus cabeus, specifically fossil remains of horse toes and horse hooves, the feet of horses. What Marsh did over many, many years in the collection of these bones was to put together absolutely clear sequencing of how one particular type of toe and foot or hoof led into change gradually over long periods of time to the next one, which led to the next one, which ended up with the modern horse, modern Equus. It was a kind of a creation of this sort of classic evolutionary bush, we think of it that way, with different branches, most of them dying out, some of them persisting over time, which lead from over 50 million years, in this case, from Hyracotherium down there at the bottom, this sort of collie-sized first horse, Eohippus it was first called, dawn horse, up until the Equus today, 50 million years. So Darwin's critics said, okay, give us an example. And Marsh said, okay, here's one. And it was just simply unquestionable. In this case, it was impossible to refute this. Darwin also argued that if you trace something like the evolution of Equus back even farther, you will see that it branched off earlier parts of that evolutionary shrub, and each of those branches branched off others, and each of those branched off still others. So what Darwin was saying is, if you trace it back far enough, you will find that every species is distantly related to just about every other. We all have this common origin. And consequently, over time, you will see species that seem to be so very different, in fact, are cousins, distant cousins, but cousins. For example, today, whales, we know that whales are distantly related to bears. Well, Darwin suggested that one example of this was a distant relationship between birds, modern birds, and modern reptiles. He said they come from some of the same branch. Again, critics said, well, prove it, show us. And Marsh did. He did in this publication, Ode on Pornithes. Ode on Pornithes was a publication, magnificently illustrated publication of birds, ancient birds, that quite clearly had other characteristics that linked them to ancient reptiles, or from dinosaurs to the ancient progenitors of modern reptiles. So it was Darwin was arguing that, for example, a hawk is related to a rattlesnake. Well, you've got to find common ancestors for each of those two things. Marsh did. He did his centerpiece of this argument was this: a 6 foot long avian aquatic avian that swam through ancient seas and on the Great Plains. He called it Hesperornis regalis. He showed that certain bones, leg bones in particular, of Hesperornis regalis were clearly related to the leg bones of other dinosaurs and other creatures, other reptilian creatures of the time that would evolve into reptiles. But the real clincher was the head of Hesperornis regalis. Well, particularly the bill, the beak, which had teeth. So here was a toothed bird, a bird with teeth. And these teeth, furthermore, were related to the teeth that we would find in dinosaurs at the time, teeth that would show that in turn evolved into the teeth of modern reptiles. So again, this was a clincher. Marsh incidentally called this Hesperornis regalis, which translates as the royal bird of the West. So in his research with the horse, which is arguably, along with the bison, the most iconic Western animal there is, and the royal bird of the West, then Marsh would draw upon this Western work to make these two great strides toward the confirmation of Charles Darwin's ideas of natural selection. Darwin thought so. Darwin was impressed by this. In fact, Darwin wrote when he received on Ornithopsis, that publication. The next day, he wrote back to Marsh and said, "This is the greatest contribution to my ideas in the last 20 years." Going back to the last 20 years, he meant the publication of Origin of Species. So Darwin was saying this discovery was the most important confirmation since I published this very controversial theory. So if we want to go back and ask the question, what makes modern America different? One way we can answer it, I think, is by saying we are in not just an economic, but a scientific superpower. And if we look back to the West, or the beginnings of that, as I said, we can see that in many, many different areas besides this one. But this is a good example. Maybe one of the most significant scientific areas of research of the day, paleontology and geology. It was in the West. These great breakthroughs were made. So in the West, you can see the beginnings of this trajectory of the United States toward this position today at the head of the modern scientific world. The third way, modern America and the question of citizenship. Now here, what I'm suggesting here is we think of what I like to call the American family, or the American household. By that I mean what we mean the populations, the people who we believe we accept as members of the American family, whether we're talking politically, socially, culturally. Who do we let in the house? And I think it's also fair to say that what we see in modern America is the comes and goes, sort of a pendulum movement, but certainly over time, a greater and greater and greater acceptance of different groups into the American family, into the house, let into the house. Not just in terms of numbers, we expect that, of course, as the population grows, but more importantly here, more specifically here, in terms of different cultural varieties, increasing diversity of participation, of inclusion in the American family. Certainly in terms of race, of ethnicity, of cultures, of language. What we see then over time is this gradual expansion or comprehensive embrace of different groups. That, I think, also characterizes modern America. Well, can we look back to the West and see beginnings of that as well? I think we can. Now, when I say that this goes back to the middle of the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, what was happening back in the middle of the 19th century that is an example of this expansion of the American family? I suspect that the first thing you would think of, quite rightfully, of course, is emancipation, the end of African American slavery at the end of the Civil War, and the efforts after the Civil War to bring freed people more fully into the American family, into American citizenship by programs like those of the Freedmen's Bureau, involved education, uh, economic, allowing an economic place in American society, educate, and various ways in which they are brought more fully into the American household. That, of course, is absolutely true. We should keep that, close to center stage. But you got to keep in mind that this didn't start with emancipation. It began really with expansion. It began with the expansion of the 1840s, when, after all, as we pushed our boundaries to the Pacific coast, we were bringing within the United States boundaries scores of different native peoples, Indian peoples, extraordinary variety of peoples, many different cultures and ways of life and languages and cosmologies and so forth, brought into the country. In places like California, this was arguably the most culturally diverse place in the Western Hemisphere, California. Each of these are different native peoples. And we also began a process of trying to integrate them more fully into the American life, promising them citizenship eventually. They finally got it in 1924. But along the way, we would school them literally, quite literally, in the American way of life. And the way to do this, of course, the laboratory in which this was to take place, this was to happen, was reservations. We can look back on reservations and we can shake our heads at the sort of the cultural arrogance of us telling people, this is who you ought to be. You've got to step forward along this ramp of progress to improve your condition, to become modern and civilized people. And we should do that. Many reasons to criticize and to condemn the reservation system. Certainly, it was ineffective. It was corrupt. It was inefficient. But it was, after all, the official attempt to bring people, to admit them into American citizenship. At least we were committed to that idea, not to destroy them, but to eventually bring them into the American household. How are we to do this? One way to get at it is to look at what are called peace medals. Peace medals. These were medals given by the administration at any one time during the 19th century to leaders of American Indian tribes and groups to express our kinship with them, to express our support of them. And on one side of each of these peace medals was a silhouette of the president at the time. On the other side was illustrations which spoke to that administration's ideal policy toward Indian people. So if you go back to Jefferson, the first peace medals under Thomas Jefferson, it focused on trade. It was the sort of clasped hands about trade with far Western people. What was it for Lincoln? What was on the verso of Lincoln's? Well, it shows an American Indian with a classic Plains headdress plowing a field. It shows a church in the background. It shows a schoolhouse on there to the left. If you look closely, you can see Indian kids out front of the schoolhouse playing baseball. So this was the vision of the Lincoln administration of what our policy should be toward Indian peoples. We should bring them into the American economy as farmers. We should Christianize them, make them part of the American mainstream by converting them to Christianity. We should educate their children in order to bring them into the mainstream of American life. But what strikes you about this, I think, should strike you about this, is the obvious parallel between this and the policy toward freed people that would begin underway just shortly after this medal was struck. We were to invite freed people into the economy through 40 acres and a mule. We were to provide to the Freedmen's Bureau, provide education for them, and we were to. This was all driven by sort of an evangelical Christianity. People like Oliver Howard, who was first head of the Freedmen's Bureau, and for whom Howard University is named today. What you see here, I think, is an almost precise parallel between our policies in the East with freed folks and in the West with American Indians. It's part of the same process. Part of this process again of bringing more people into more different groups into American society. But at the same time, you can also say, as a basic characteristic of modern America, that every step of the way in opening up our embrace of new groups has been met with resistance, often violent resistance. People are saying, no, no, we need to keep the American family tighter than it is. We need to keep certain groups out of that family. We need to keep doors to the American household shut and locked. And this was true in the West as well. Again, we think of this most often, I think, in terms of the East, of free people, the violent resistance of the Ku Klux Klan, the efforts, especially after 1877, 1880, to clamp down, to impose a racial white supremacist order, racial order on the East. But the same thing was happening out West. There were those who were attempting to do something basically the same out West. In California, we see a case of, I think, unquestioned efforts at genocide, attempted genocide. The term genocide is thrown around, I think, too easily today. It does not apply in many other places in the West toward Indians. It does in California. Outright assaults on Native peoples, slaughter of them, the efforts by militias funded by the California government to send militias against Native gatherings and to slaughter them, to kill them. Others to enforce, bring them into forcefully as forced labor, especially including in those grain farms of Central California. You see here, one result of this was this catastrophic decline of California Native population, roughly an estimated 150,000 in 1848, the time of discovery, almost something in the neighborhood of 90% over the next 50 years. Well, the Indians weren't the only ones. Hispanic peoples were brought into the American household with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave citizenship to all former Mexican citizens. If they chose to, they could choose to go back to Mexico or to keep their Mexican citizenship. But if they wished, they were granted citizenship with a stroke of the pen. But just as with Indian peoples, there was violent resistance against this, especially attempts to impose a white down racial order in California and in the Southwest, where the concentration of Hispanic peoples was. Once again, we associate this kind of thing most with the Southeast in the aftermath of emancipation, resistance to emancipation. And we think of lynching, especially after around 1880, as the most obvious expression of this hostility. Well, recent research now suggests that not only was the same thing happening out West, but it was happening on a scale that was at least as appalling as that among freed people in the Southeast. The way historians measure lynchings in a group is to ask how many are there per 100,000 people of that particular group over a particular time. We associate mostly with the Southeast, in particular in places like Mississippi, which had the highest rate of lynching, as far as we can tell. What was it? After 1880, it was, we estimate about 53 per 100,000 persons. What if we ask the same question about the lynchings of Hispanos in Southern California and the Southwest during the period leading up to 1880, during the period immediately after expansion, 1848 to around 1880? What was the rate there? 473. Now, again, we're just starting to do this research. It's far better documented in places like Mississippi than it is a place like California. But the initial indication is that this is at least as awful, at least as appalling out West as it was in the East. For obvious example would be the Chinese in the West, who come in great numbers, especially after about 1852. And in this case, the effort was not to bring them into the American family, but rather to exclude them. The opposition to the Chinese presence was so great that in 1887, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the only time in American history when a particular people have been denied access to this country, not just limited, but denied access to this country on the basis of their ethnicity. Different, simply kept out. As you see here, the idea was we build our own Chinese wall, the Great Wall of China, in this case to exclude them. So if we again ask ourselves, what does modern America mean? I think part of the answer would be, well, it's a story of in the 20th century, in the 21st century, a story of a gradually expanding inclusion of different groups, and a story at the same time of bitter resistance, often violent resistance to that. We see this sort of swing back and forth during the 20th century up until today. Today, as you know, we are going through another period in which there seems to be a rise of efforts of white supremacy, of violence against Asian people in this country. So we're sort of swinging the pendulum, swinging back now to this other way. That's what makes America, one of the things that makes America modern. In addition to our, in addition to our, in addition to our scientific supremacy and our economic supremacy. Well, I hope this has given you some sense of what I'm trying to do in this book. In this case, the to show, tell the story not just of the birth of the West, but also about the role of the West in this fundamental transformation of American life, this shift of the American narrative to help us understand who we are today. So what I'm suggesting here, I suppose, is we cannot possibly understand who we are today as Americans without looking back and bringing into this story the role and the transformation of the nation through the transformation and the birth of the American West. I hope that's given you some understanding of what this is, and hope that's given you some incentive to explore this question, in my book or elsewhere, to explore this question, to bring the West more fully into the American story. In any case, thank you so much for this. I enjoyed it greatly. Again, my thanks to the National Archives, not just for the invitation to be with you here today, but also, most of all, through their extraordinary work in helping people like me in my professional effort to try to understand the American past a bit more fully. Thank you very much.